All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Alicia Bell. I am the organizing manager for Free Press. I also am a part of the Leadership Collective for Media 2070, a project on media reparations that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. But before we get started, I wanted to pass this to Dustin, who's going to give a little bit of intro to tech, some logistics there. So Dustin, I'll pass it to you to take it away.
Hey, thank you. This is Dustin. So just very briefly, I just wanted to let folks know that some conversation will be happening in chat. There's already been some documents that's dropped in there. You can access that through the chat feature if you're on a desktop at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile app, there's a chat feature that you can access it through. There's also closed captioning that's available. The closed captioning feature has a symbol that says CC within a rectangular box. If you click on that, you're able to view subtitles. That brings up the transcripts. There's also another option to view the full transcript, which will give you a text-only document of the transcripts. So that way you can kind of see what might have been missed, or if you need to step away, you can follow the conversation that way. I'm also available for general tech support. My camera will be off the entire time, but please feel free to private message me if you're having any tech issues and I can work through it with you. My name, you can find me under Tech Dustin. Thank you, and I'll pass it off to the presenters.
All right, thanks, Dustin. So again, welcome to, this is the Critical Need for Black Media Reparations. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for spending some time this Saturday afternoon. Or if this is the future and you're watching the broadcast of this or the recording of this, thank you for taking the time to do that as well. Greetings from the past. This is Alicia Bell, Media 2070 and Media Reparations. So I saw that some folks were already in the chat announcing themselves, introducing themselves, but I really want to encourage everyone, if you haven't yet, to just take some time, introduce yourself, maybe your name, where you are, one of your favorite sensations or your pronouns or something that's interesting about you, just so that folks can get to know you. I'm gonna pass it over to the panelists in just a moment to introduce themselves, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Free Press, which is the organization that I work with. So Free Press is a national media and tech advocacy organization. We've been doing work around journalism, media consolidation, internet access, and internet rights, broadband access for a while now. And pretty soon we're going to be launching a project on media reparations, which is why we're here today. So we have Colette Watson, who is our Radical Hospitality Coordinator. I'll pass it to you, Colette, to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. This is Colette Watson. I am just so very, 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 very happy to be in this space with each of you today. Thank you, Alicia. Media 2070 and the critical need for media reparations is close to my heart. I'm from South Carolina. I'm now in Arizona and excited to just build with y'all in the chat space today. We have a couple of documents that have been shared there. We're going to build a gallery wall later with some of our visions for the future. For those of you who aren't already there, and just thank you again for being in this space with us. Thank you, Alicia.
All right, so today we have 3 panelists with us who are going to be sharing some more on what reparations could look like, what harm has happened in the past. But before we get to that part, I want to pass it to them to kick us off with some introductions. So Manolia, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Manolia Charlotin. I'm a co-founder of Press On, a Southern media collective that catalyzes change and advances justice through the practice of movement journalism. And I'm based here in New Orleans. So happy to be with Free Press today to continue some of the work that we have been doing to imagine a new media system that works for all the people.
Thanks, Manolia. Brandy, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Brandy Collins Dexter. I'm the Senior Campaign Director at Color of Change, which is the largest online racial justice organization with 7 million members. I oversee our media, cultural, and economic justice department, so doing a lot of work around media accountability and opening up opportunities, particularly for Black-owned media. And thank you for having me.
And then we have one more panelist with us who is not on video, but is on the phone, on the line. So I'll pass it to Janine Jackson to introduce herself.
Can folks hear me?
Yep.
I thank. Great. I'm sorry. I'm tech, insufficient is what I would say, and I'm gonna pretend now. When I get a chance, I'm gonna try to hook up the video. But what I want to say is I'm Janine Jackson. I'm the program director of FAIR, the Media Watch Group, and I'm the host and producer of FAIR's radio show Counterspin. So I've been a media critic at FAIR since, I guess, 1991, But like most of us, I've been a hardcore amateur media critic since I was born, right? My whole life, I think most of us. So I just want to hook up, and I'm going to try to make my tech work better. But I just want to say, FAIR pays attention to mainstream, corporate, whatever you want to call it, legacy, traditional media, but it's not about us thinking that's the main thing, that's where it's at. And so I just want to say that the reason that we pay attention to this stuff is because your parents and your coworkers and your legislators pay attention to this stuff. So we're going to need to sharpen our tools, right, to respond to this kind of thing, to the myths and the misinformation that the folks that we care about and that we have to engage with. So my goal is not about making the New York Times a better New York Times. It's about wanting to live in a society where we speak with our own voice, where we get to tell the stories that we can tell, and that where we get to stay in a conversation with one another, including a conversation that's about subverting and upending the structures in the society and everything that we're about. So I just think engaging with big media, corporate media is, and figuring out how to battle that is one of the paths of the stones of the things that we're trying to walk on. All right. And in the meantime, I'm going to try to figure out my tech situation. But howsoever, I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Janine. And thanks, Brandy and Manolia. We're going to hear a little bit more from Janine, Brandy, and Manolia in just a little bit. But before we do that, I do want to offer some reminders for today. I really want to encourage everyone to be present in this space and whatever that means for you, to do whatever you need to do. Earlier, as folks were arriving, we had some music playing. We were encouraging people to get snacks, to get dinner, to get things that feel good to their body, to get things to snuggle with, whatever that looks like. Because we really want you to be able to be present however you need to be. I want to encourage people to take care of themselves throughout this time. We are broadcasting this. We are going to be recording this. So if you don't get to be a part of this entire conversation, it's totally fine. We understand. If you have to leave, then there will be opportunities to be a part of this conversation in the future. So do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself and to meet your needs. Really want to remind folks of that before we get started. For a few logistic pieces, I wanted to remind folks, Dustin mentioned this earlier, but there are going to be a few interactive opportunities throughout our time together. And if you'd like to participate in kind of sharing those things, you should be able to raise your hand, and we can allow you to kind of share into the public. So when we decided to do this session at the AMC, initially we were going to have a smaller group of people and have a lower capacity, but we did decide to expand our capacity. And what that meant is that the trade-off was that we couldn't have small group conversation. It was not as interactive. So we wanted to try to create as many interactive opportunities as we can. So we do have the Google Docs that Colette has shared. We have some conversation prompts that she shared in the chat box that folks can interact with. And then when we're sharing things back, when we're talking about what we imagine for reparations, when we're talking about why we're here, and then later on when we're talking about our vision for the future of media, if you do want to share publicly, what we can do, you can do is raise your hand on the, not your physical hand, but on Zoom. If you just kind of hover over your name, that's something that you'll be able to do. And then we'll be able to see that. And what we'll do is we'll click allow to talk, and then everybody will be able to hear you. So want to let folks know that. If you don't want to talk though, that's totally okay. And you can drop responses in the Google Docs and then later in Padlet. There will also be an opportunity throughout the panel for Q&A, for questions and answers. If you do have a question, feel free to drop that in the Q&A box. We'll be using those to source questions towards the end of the panel. And then whatever questions we don't get to, we'll go through and we'll curate some of those, and we'll be sharing those in a future newsletter outreach to folks. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them, and all hope is not lost if we don't get to all of those questions. So with that, I want to share back a little bit of what we heard today when we asked people why they joined us. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Here we go. All right, so these are some of the things that folks were saying about why they joined us. There are folks who, somebody said, media has long been a tool for Black subjugation by white supremacy, going back to Birth of a Nation. Even the first recorded documentaries are false propaganda against the Indigenous. We deserve to tell our own stories, and from a place of joy, not always from a place of trauma. Someone said, I work at and I'm a board member for a local radio station, as well as working towards just transition in my other work. This all needs reparations, and I'm looking for more ways to bring this into my work. Someone else said, I'm a librarian and a mother, and so Black media affects both my personal and professional life. For folks who do want to read more through other reasons why people are here, there's several pages of reasons that folks have offered. And also feel free, if you haven't had a chance to interact with this document, to go in and add what made you decide to join us. And before we talk about what we are thinking about in terms of reparations, we asked you, when you think of media reparations, what do you hear? What do you smell? What do you feel? What do you conjure? Folks said justice instead of just us, Black, queer, and trans beauty alive and thriving, non-custodial, community-led media archiving. I see green, I smell soil, I see the presence of our ancestors, I hear loud, free, wholehearted laughter of all ages and birds chirping. To embrace and celebrate Black communities, Black culture is to honor and respect Mother Earth, Mother Nature. Incense, oils, sisterhoods, brotherhoods, siblинghoods. So there's all kinds of things that folks are kind of hearing, seeing, smelling, feeling, conjuring when they think of reparations. And we really want to lift that into this space, because it is by no means our intention to be gatekeepers with this conversation or with this work at all. Because we know that no one individual or no one organization can get to deliberation. But it's going to take all of us working together in collaboration to figure out what that is and how we get there, and to build the power necessary to make that real. So I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about this project, Media 70, that I shared with folks earlier and that we've been mentioning throughout.
I hate that I'm not available because I look so cute, you know. And I honestly, you know, I'm not going to work that out. But howsoever, I feel so honored to be part of this, and to be part of a conversation where we really are dreaming, you know, where we really are dreaming about what we want to do. And I feel like there's a lot of folks who are actually ready, are ready for the conversation that we want to have. They're ready for it. And they don't know they're ready for it, but they are ready for it. And they are, and so I think it's a time about visioning, and really about visioning. And you know, folks can have their anger arguments. They're going to do it. They're doing it. They're doing it in front of us. They're having their, you know, disagreements. But what they're all hungry for, what they're all looking for, is a vision. And so I'm just so happy to be part of this, you know. So let's get to it, you know, in terms of the specifics of what the vision is, because I think folks are hungry for it, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that's why when we named this project is called Media 2070, and when we named it, we knew we were working in Afrofuturisms and queer futurisms, and the links and the intersections and liminal space between that, but we really wanted it to be an invitation to dream up media reparations. And that's why this is actually our first panel about media reparations. We've talked about it in different spaces with different people individually, but part of the reason we wanted that to happen here at the Allied Media Conference is because, as Vanessa said in the chat, Allied Media Conference is all about imagination and visioning and living the kind of world that we believe is possible. So on that, so Media 2070 is, I want to ground us in one piece of information, right? So when the first US newspapers were published, it was still illegal for Black people to read or write. That's a truth and an understanding that we're grounding in when we're doing this work. This work is an effort at radically transforming who has the capital to tell their own stories by 2070, 50 years from today. And when we're looking at 2070, it's because in every 50 years, there is some sort of reckoning around media and racial justice. In 1919, that was the Chicago Commission, examining the role of media and journalism in the race riots of 1919. In 1968, that was the Kerner Commission, talking about the role of media and journalism and news and racial injustice and race riots that were happening. Here we are now, about 50 years later, and so we're looking at 2070, which is 50 years from now. This work is an idea, welcoming critique and feedback. It is transformation work within a lineage of civil rights, racial justice organizing, and calls for reparations. It's a visibilizing of the way that media has taken part in and supported state violence and harm against Black people. It seeks to highlight the role of media as a lever for racial justice and subsequently the repair and reconciliation necessary to build strong, free, democratic communities. We believe that to achieve full freedom and democracy, it's critical to change the historic media narrative about Black people. This is an attempt at that change, and it's an attempt at creating a world that's never existed. So in 2020, which is this year, we're going to be releasing an essay next month and launching a consortium and coalition of different organizations. I'm going to share in a little bit how to sign up to that. In 2020 into 2021, we'll be hosting visioning convenings, we'll be organizing, socializing, coalition building, consulting and coaching newsrooms to figure out what practice change looks like. And then in 2021 into 2023 and beyond, we'll also be moving into legal and legislative organizing to think about what are the policy changes that we need to make reparations real. So just a bit of a kind of smattering of harm that we are highlighting and thinking about in this work. So in 1706, the Boston newsletter editor John Campbell writes that the local Black population was much addicted to stealing, lying, and purloining. 1 month after its founding, the paper publishes its first runaway slave ads. In 1868, in Wilmington, North Carolina, the publisher and editor of the News and Observer, Josephus Daniels, plays a leading role in the only overthrow of a local government in the nation's history. In 1919, the U.S. Department of Justice arrests San Antonio Enquirer editor G.W. Bolden under charges related to the Espionage Act for publishing a letter criticizing the U.S. Army's hanging of 14 Black soldiers. In 1955, Medgar Evers and the Mississippi NAACP files suit against Jackson's WLBT-TV for airing racist programming in 1968. And then in 1968, a federal court ruled in favor of the activists, saying for the first time that citizens have legal standing to challenge FCC licenses. In 1995, the Republican-controlled Congress passes legislation that ends the minority tax certificate program, which had helped to increase broadcast ownership by people of color from 1% to 3%. In 2017, a study by Color of Change finds that Black families represent 59% of coverage in news and opinion media about poverty at networks such as CNN and Fox News, even though they made up just 27% of poor families in the US. So this is what we're building this work on and building this conversation on. What you see right now is a paid newspaper ad in the Virginia Gazette from 1769. Newspapers ran several different runaway slave ads, and this is one that Thomas Jefferson had published. I'll pause here for a moment so people can look at this.
Yeah.
And then in its 1969 report, the Community Relations Service and the Kerner, also known as the Kerner Commission, observed that few American institutions have so completely excluded minority group members from influence and control as have the news media. This failure is reflected by general insensitivity and indifference and is verified by ownership, management, and employment statistics. The report noted that no general audience newspaper, magazine, or radio or television station is owned or managed by minority group persons. At that time, people of color owned fewer than a dozen radio stations, and whites owned almost all Spanish language radio and TV stations. This is the history we're working with, but we also want to think about how we will know we're winning as we fight in the pursuit of media reparations. So we'll know we're winning when Black people have the social and financial capital necessary to tell our own stories, and this truth has helped facilitate parallel truths in other Indigenous communities and other communities of color. We'll know we're winning when community members are able to articulate and engage across the country in transforming media systems, infrastructure towards becoming reparative media systems and infrastructure. We'll know we're winning when there's an abundance of media that exists, showcasing the possibilities and existence of repair and reconciliation. When students are learning about the media's role in harming communities and creating racial injustice and the possibilities for change. When media reparations is a common sense concept, when media reparations legislative and litigation wins, when reparations legislation happens at a local, state, and federal level, and when reparations broadly includes media-specific language. We'll know we're winning when this is an issue that intersectionally is woven into various economic justice, racial justice, and other movements. We'll know we're winning when we have deeper solidarity between media justice organizers and organizers and activists who find political home in other allied movements. So I really appreciate, even in the why people are here, people lifting up things like climate justice, people lifting up their identities and roles as parents, as librarians, and thinking about the intersections that already exist between these spaces. So to learn more when we're launching this and to stay in touch with us, you can connect at bit.ly/joinmedia2070, and Colette will be dropping that in the chat for folks to take a look at. But without further ado, I do want to bring in our panelists into this conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen so we can really focus on them. And I want to start with Brandy. Brandy, we're talking a little bit about, I just shared some of the kind of historical harms around media that are media specific. And I want to ask you, what are some of the most glaring examples of modern and historical media harms that you know of?
Yes, and thanks again, everybody. So, I mean, I want to pull it back a little bit and just reflect on the fact that it's interesting that we're in this national and global discourse about misinformation and disinformation, because as has already been pointed out in the chat, we have long seen media, mainstream media in certain ways as the architects of fake news about our communities. And often the media has served as a tool of hegemony, agents of the status quo, framers of the harms and impacts in the ways that facilitate war globally and at home against marginalized and colonialized communities. And so it's often interesting because, like, no one loves the media more than the media loves themselves. But even in that question of who are we talking about when we're talking about the media, the dominant understanding of that is often rooted in class, tied to geography, ethnicity, culture, language, gender, medium, among other things. Oftentimes when we look at folk music or hip hop or other forms of media, music, it is media that is sharing what is immediately happening in our communities, often giving warning signs and a number of other things, but those aren't considered legitimate forms of media. So for me, as I thought about this question, I think I would break it out into 6 layers of harm. So one would be anti-Black myth making. And, that's true insert marginalized class, but like I'm gonna focus on Black communities. And so the anti-Black myth making that comes from things like the false myth of the crack baby that then made its way into policy making. The welfare queen, Willie Horton, was a notable example from the 90s of use of this like super predator trope that we've seen continue to haunt us. We've also seen like use of mugshots and different things in a way that mirrors what we just discussed around like slave ads in overuse of Black and brown communities mugshots in our life, even in our deaths. As perpetuators of a harm to the white establishment. Second would be deliberate misrepresentation of events and distortions of events. Some of the ways in which we've seen this come into play is like oftentimes when we talk about harms that go in that have happened in our communities historically, when you're talking about Tulsa and these other places in which white mobs have gone into Black communities, communities of color, and destroyed land and taken lives. Those are often framed as like a riot, as if that's somehow a mutual fight, as opposed to a massacre, or what those things actually are. The reporting of death is often done in lumps, so that you can't tell how many like Black lives lost versus white lives, which again creates this sort of distortion of facts. And then in recently, this kind of false equivalency that we see, like the histrionic brushstrokes that property damage is painted as in a way that's meant to like seat that unequal plank as the loss of Black lives. That sort of distortion of things in a way that, again, perpetuates harm to our communities. Third, elite white male thought framed as default logic without question. And so some of the ways in which we've seen that play out is, Cotton's op-ed in New York Times was the most recent example. An op-ed factually inaccurate, meant to cultivate harm, run without the editor so much as even looking at it to do a fact check. In the early days of Wired, Rush Limbaugh, Newt Gingrich, and Wired is one of the foremost publications from Silicon Valley. They would have their views run critically unedited with all sorts of frameworks that then created this sort of bricks of what we see in Silicon Valley. I'd also say the chronic underreporting of trauma. Again, like in the early days of COVID-19, one of the things that happened was like online, we saw a lot of false narratives and memes that said that Black people were not susceptible to coronavirus. And as that was happening, the early deaths in the US were actually Black people. That was underreported. They were reported without race. There were a lot of ways in which media shortcomings combined with Silicon Valley shortcomings directly contributed to this rise of disproportionate Black death. And then finally, I'll say we haven't even fully gotten into the issues of just like underpaying, underhiring, first fired, the ways in which we're locked out of decision-making access within media. So that very tangible financial and information loss that we've seen would be the last thing. And I know there's many more, but I'll pause there because I know Janine, you've got some stuff too. So I want you to jump in on this.
Well, I hardly need to jump in on this because I feel like it's been actually utterly covered. I just really want to co-sign what Brandy has said. And, in terms of talking about historical and modern media harms, which is what we're doing in terms of talking about what does actually need to be repaired for, like what actually are harms done that it's not just about like, let's just pretend it didn't happen and start again from now. What do we need to go back and actually interrogate and have a conversation about? And honestly, I think Brandy has hit every point that I would hit. What I would say is, if we're talking about overt things, well, when there's a crime and the Black victim of the crime is criticized by the media and the white perpetrators of the crime are humanized, well, all right, that tells you whose life. My thing is about what media tell you in their language, in their choices, right? It tells you whose life is valuable, whose life is not valuable, who should be believed when they speak, and who should not be believed, whose death is to be mourned, and whose death is not to be mourned. But I want to go another way and also we're talking about how do media harm? Why do we need reparations from media? Well, when media, corporate media talk about Africa as if it's one country, right? Because we don't deserve differentiation. We don't deserve that. We're just Black folks, and that's that. And that's the dishonoring. That's racism, right? That's racism, where it's not about, hey, this guy, they called him a thug. We need to interrogate everything about the language of media and find the racism where it's at. And that's one of those places. So Tom Brokaw, a lot of folks listening, born after he was, don't even know who I'm talking about. But Tom Brokaw is like this NBC guy, kind of, avuncular. He talks about when the United States is invading Iraq, he says, we need to be careful because in a week we're going to own that country. That's racism. That's racism. We need to identify that where it's at. When folks say this is a country where people don't look like us and so we get to be in charge of them, that's also racism. So when I think about it, I think about it's not just when they call it out, when they say it, right? It's about the assumption environment that corporate media exist in. And it's about what I would say the lens of pathology in which Black people in news media, and especially local news media, if they're not athletes or entertainers, then just look at where they show up in the news. And it's going to be crime or drugs or government aid, in other words, drains on society. So that has everything to do with where media are comfortable pointing their cameras, where they feel like they can demand a perp walk, right? You know, from who they decide they can describe as crimes as coming from, and who they don't think they can do that. So the effects of media racism on public opinion, for example, to take one example on crime, that's manifest. We know that. That's documented. We understand that the way that media cover crime influences public people's understanding of who's going to be a victim of crime, is who's going to be a perpetrator of crime, and we understand that those opinions are wrong. They don't match up to reality. They don't match up to reality. What they match up to is racism, right? You know, so it's not hard to document and demonstrate the way that corporate media underscore and implement, you know, a racist understanding of society. We know that. We know that. We have a documentation of that. What we don't have is an understanding of how we need to change that, how we need to engage that, how we need to, you know, get involved with that. So, you know, we have a situation where journalists recognize that they have racism involved in their choices that they're making. We have a situation where there's years and years and years of research that indicate that corporate media are racist and that they have a harmful, you know, impact. We just don't have a conversation about that where we recognize we got to do something else about this. We have to change media. We have to change media because we need to have a conversation with one another about how to change the structures of our society. And we can't have that conversation if we're trying to have it through media that are on one side, you know, that have chosen their side.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
No,
So that's.
Oh, go ahead, Janine.
I'm just saying. I'm saying that, you know, like we're trying to pretend like let's use media to have this conversation, but the media that we're using are corrupted. They have. It's we have to make new tools to have the conversations that we want to have.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and especially thinking about kind of the full encompassing of media. And I heard that a little bit, and what you were saying, Brandy, when you were talking about kind of music as media. So when we're thinking about the future of media, we're kind of historically thinking about news and information, journalism, how information has been shared. But we know that future is not just journalism, it's not just news media, that it's also music, it's also film, it's also art, visual art. It's also whatever the future of social media and technology is. It's all of those different futures that play a role in figuring out what are we going to do to create and tell stories and share information. And I feel so thankful to be in this space where we were really grounded with that the other day during the opening ceremony when Raquel and Joey were talking about what does abolition look like in the context of media? What does transformation look like, right? And talking about that, especially at the intersections of trans Black lives, what does that abolition look like? And so I do think that reparations plays a role in figuring out what that abolition and that transformation is. I'm curious from you, Manolia, what does that mean to you? Like, what is media reparations for you? What is the possibility that's there?
Well, I'm going to take a step back a little bit and talk, when we keep talking about media as a system, we gave some really powerful examples of how it shapes narrative, but I want us to take a step back and just understand what narrative is and what we're talking about just a little bit before I get to my sort of take on it. People with a particular perception of the world based on their values, their education, and their lived experiences have the power to create narratives. Those narratives help shape how other people perceive the world. So what we're doing is, one, we're in framing this need for repair, is we're telling folks who are usually in the position of power, which are white men, that they indeed help shape people's perception of the world. And by telling them that, we're saying, therefore you have a responsibility, right? And that means you can then be held accountable, okay? And one of the key things, we're talking about media a lot, but I think the focus here for us is mass media, and a cornerstone of that mass media is news media. It's one of the reasons why one of the first laws passed in this country, you know, as a new set of federal states, was to implement the national mailing system, right? They wanted to be able to get information. They wanted to get newspapers out and get information to the populace. Well, why is that such an important thing to do? Why does a new nation need that kind of infrastructure at the founding of the nation? It's because they understood that they needed to help, they needed propaganda to shape people's understanding of the world, right? So the second part is control. So news media is a part of a system of control. And what we're saying is we're holding them accountable by saying, not only are you responsible, but you are part of this white supremacist control. Also, we're saying that you have a particular ideology. Okay, like a lot of times we see one of the most powerful concepts that have been levied against marginalized folks in this long argument we've been having to hold media accountable for how they shape culture is the concept of objectivity. Okay, that we're news people. Our job is to be objective. Well, if you think that your white male point of view is the default point of view, if you believe that to be objective, that means you believe that everyone else's experience is naturally subjective. And therefore, this concept of objectivity has been leveraged against marginalized folks as we've been fighting for our space in this ecosystem. So I want to just leverage that too, is to say, what they're saying to us is their ideology is the ideology without even recognizing that they're doing that, right? So I wanted to just make that point. And when we talk about the white supremacist structure, I want us to really keep thinking about it as an ideology. It is, they believe that the world should be like this, and therefore they made the world in the image that they believe it to be. Right, so they leverage their imagination to build a system of control so that they can be on top. And therefore, to do that, you have to control the images that help shape people's imaginations to do so. So that I wanted to just frame it that way, because we have to understand that white supremacist culture is a very creative and imaginative one, and it's very robust, it's very brilliantly made, and they've had time and resources to shape these systems, okay? So that's sort of like, I wanted to frame it that way. We also have the power to create narrative. We also have the power to build collective power. And for us, I think the key thing with reparations is for us to define it for ourselves, first of all, to say, here is what we want. And I really loved how you all started, you all gave us several instances of how we win. So, because so frequently we're having these conversations, we're defining the problem and we're not defining like the terms of engagement to say, here's how we gonna say we gonna win, right? What stood out to me was an abundance of media that exists. The idea that abundance is a central value in us knowing when we win. Okay, so I think that's a really first thing in reparations, for us to say a plurality of media exists. The other thing I want to lift up was from, because I hope y'all were able to catch the opening plenary with Adrienne Murray Brown, Autumn Brown, and Channing Nicholas, because they give us so much to work with. But one of the frameworks that Adrienne lifted up was, there's a reason we were meant to orient towards indigenous leadership. And to me, what that means many things. But one of the things that means is, one, we have access to ancestral memory, okay? Because to imagine is to do that, is to access stored memory, all right? And so within us, within our indigeneity as oppressed peoples, we have access to that ancestral memory. It is part of imagination and image making. So I wanted to sort of lift that up as a key framework for repair. The last thing I want to lift up is the idea of indigenous leadership is one that is collective. That is who we've been. We have lived in collective since the beginning of time, right? And so, and by we, I'm talking about folks who are currently oppressed. And so we have a lot to learn from folks who are indigenous to this land that we live in, for Black folks that we're fighting for, in terms of how we leverage our collectivity in our imagination. You all obviously are modeling this right now to say, hey, listen, we're going to vision this thing together. We are accessing it right now. But I think for reparations, we need to be clear that it is a collective endeavor, and therefore all the solutions that we should uplift come from localized collective endeavors. There are communities already engaged in media reparations. They're just engaged in a part where they're just building what they want to see. They're building what they need. And that to me is a really critical part of reparations. It's not just about what we can get when we hold other people accountable. It's also how we harness our collective power to build what we need and what we know to be true. I'll pass it to Brandy.
I mean, amen. Thank you for that. I know that we want to leave time for questions, and so I did want to touch on a couple things around this question of part of what's sitting with me is that when I think of media reparations and the harms done, like, I think that there is not enough that we're discussing or understanding or repairing in the direct linkages between the role of media and the policy making that has directly led to our harms and deaths. So, like, I'm from Chicago, I live in Baltimore, and when I think of the tropes that we see throughout media, even, when we think about The Wired, which had a lot of, Black talent, Black writers, but like the narrative that was set around Baltimore and how that linked to certain policy making that has then led to a depletion of resources. And then you have a governor of Maryland who is, very much hard right-wing nationalist, who's given a certain amount of rehabilitation because he presents in a certain way. So he's offered a lot of platforms by people that take away from, like, the harms that he's done to Black communities in Maryland, Larry Hogan. And so, like, when we talk about media reparations and when we talk about, like, how do we undo the damage? It's such a hard question because, one, you can't undo it. You can't really unwind history. But it's like, we also can't reform. We can't have this discussion in a context of what does, like, reform of the system look like. We can only have this in the context of a breaking of a system that was built on our backs, and a sort of acknowledgement of that. And then how do we move forward from that? The breaking of the journalism school model and the harm that that's done in reporting, the breaking of, like, all of these systems that are interwoven in order to maintain an apartheid, a political, economic, and social apartheid on the backs of our communities. And so I appreciate, I know we want to get to, like, some broader solutions, and I want to move us there, but we can't forget that there's so much of this that can't be unwoven, and that without any sort of acknowledgement or framing or understanding of that, we can never be repaired or even begin to be made whole to the extent that's possible.
Absolutely, and I really love the framework that some organizers have offered in different spaces of what do we need to block and dismantle, what do we need to build and create, and then how can we maintain ourselves and create kind of wellness, self-care, self-defense as we're doing those things, right? How can we be in those spaces as we're blocking and building? And so I do want to pause, and there are some questions that we received from folks. We have a few more questions ourselves, but I do want to offer time for those questions. And so I'll share those. The first one is with the increase of digital technology. Do you think it's possible that the forecasted 50 years that's based on history will actually start becoming smaller intervals of time? And I will start off by saying yes. I think one of the things, that we've seen over just the past few months is that time speeds up when it needs to. And that we can shift time. There are so many Black folks who talk about the way that whiteness and white supremacy has control of time. And I think that as we engage with more reparations and more decolonization, that we will see some of those intervals changing. But I wanted to open it up to y'all to see if y'all have any thoughts on that. Do you think it'll take less than 50 years to really create the media landscape the transformed media landscape that we want to see?
I mean, I'm doing that right now. That's the work I'm doing. So I'm trying to make it happen before that. But I know we're in a collective endeavor and we're at different places of it. You know what I'm saying? So there are folks building the world we need and the world we see right now. And so I think that we each have our own sort of lanes to figure out where are we in that process, because we all have a different space. But I understand the framing in terms of like 50 years. I think time is a construct, right? It is our way of measuring what we see together as a collective humanity. And therefore, when people question time, what they're really questioning is our capacity to move as a collective. I mean, that's just how I see it. And so if folks are like, do y'all think we can do this sooner? I'm all for that. Then there's folks who can be on the other side to say, wait, this system took so long to build, right? And so it's going to take a long time to dismantle. To that I say, if you've ever built a house, or if you've ever, whatever you've built, right? A reputation, a career, over years and years and years, it don't take much to destroy it. If you think about some of the what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, right, of what's been destroyed. And so I do think it's an opportunity for us to dream as boldly as possible, to say that we can not only build what we want, but also dismantle what's happening on the other side of that, even though we know we're going to encounter some severe pushback and some violent pushback to that, because folks are not just going to let us dismantle just because, right? They're not going to let us take our power back. That's not how that works. However, I do like the idea of questioning time as a means to challenge ourselves, not necessarily a means to try to measure how big the task is. I don't know if that answered the question.
I hear that. Folks hear me? Janine? Hear?
Yeah.
All right. I hear all of that, frankly. And I think it's kind of what I'm saying in my social media spaces, such as they are. Not really that kind of person. Don't do that well. Howsoever, what I'm saying is, did you know how things would work time-wise? No, you didn't. You didn't, you had an idea, and God bless, and that's how you thought things would work. But stuff's different now. So keep your eyes on the prize. What do you actually want? What do you actually want? And I get kind of frustrated with folks who are like, well, I want this, but this person who's pushing for it, I don't like. You're like, well, so who fucking cares that you don't like that person? Do you want what they're pushing for? My mother told me years ago, you have to separate people from their ideas. And I thought that was just the dumbest thing I ever heard, because people are their ideas, aren't they? That's what people are. And I just didn't get it. And honestly, I'm 55 years old, and it's been the last 5 years that I've figured out what my mother, who was a longtime social worker, public advocate, did it all, right? What she meant when she was saying separate people from their ideas. You can say, I want this, I'm for this, and even though this person that spoke up about it turns out to be imperfect, I'm still actually for this idea, you know. And what I want to say, you know, is just, there's a question, what bold change should we be dreaming about? And my thing is, what do media need to do? What do corporate media need to do? Well, what corporate media need to do is to redefine the project, frankly, away from what I understand it to be, is defining news as what powerful people say and do, right? Need to define the project away from the pretense of news from nowhere, right? Objectivity. All news involves choices. All news involves listening to some people, not listening to other people. Calling it objectivity just means erasing those choices in a way that serves power, right? So journalists need to get over the idea, believing it or selling it, that what we're calling for is diversity. That's not it. That's not it. They need to recognize that diversity, I call it like the sprinkle on white supremacy sundae, right? You know, diversity is a nicety. It's a way to give a kind of, you know, United Colors of Benetton cover to what can be an essentially white supremacist enterprise, right? Diversity, what is it? Well, it's achieved when white people tell it's achieved, right? You know, 10 people in a room, one of them's black. White people are going to tell you that's diverse. Is that diversity? So, no, we can't. Diversity is not the goal, right? We have to talk about racial justice. We have to talk about justice. And it's not about diversity. Diversity is about, if we get a lot of folks who look different and then we might get some stories, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, if you don't have folks who can decenter your white supremacist view, you're not, it's not like you're going to miss some stories. Oh, you're going to miss some stories. You're going to get every story you're doing wrong, right? It's not about just not being better. It's about doing bad journalism. And so what I want to say here is, it's not like journalism plus diversity. Wouldn't that be nice? It's not freaking journalism if it's not anti-racist. It's not like journalism is better. It's not like it would be a tweak to journalism. You know, it's that you're doing it wrong when you're doing it racist, you know. And so I have this thing about Kerner and the Kerner Commission, and I'm into that, and I'm interested in that. And folks should know the Kerner Commission was so hot that Johnson didn't release it, right? Lyndon Johnson wouldn't release it because he didn't like what it said. But my point is just, it's not about if we could just get some more Black people in the room, right? It's about the work that has to be done to decenter the white male view. And that's not just about getting different people in the room. It's not just about, you know, mixing it up and, you know, let's do something, you know, different and get some people of color in there and make it more colorful. It's a deep, fundamental, systemic change that media don't want to make, right? So when we talk about you know, how do we change media? What are reparations? What does that mean? It has to mean something more than just getting some Black and brown people in the room. It has to mean changing the objective journalism, changing the definition of journalism away from what powerful people say and do. And if it's not that, then it's not nothing.
Can I offer a definition that we have been working on at Press On? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
So, and this is still in progress because again, we're doing this in community, right? So for us, movement journalism is we've been sort of it's the term that we have that is evolving to sort of talk about the practice that we are descendants from, that we are claiming our heritage of, the lineage of, right? So from Ida B. Wells to now. So movement journalism for us is in service to liberation. This does not mean that journalists are necessarily soapbox for activism, but what it does is it fosters collaboration between journalists and grassroots movements and supports journalism created by oppressed and marginalized people. And so for us, what we're saying is folks who tell stories are doing so within a collective framework, which means the folks who are pushing for change, our movement folks, our grassroots movement folks, the folks who are pushing for change, they are lifting up systems, they're lifting up actions, they're lifting up the process of change, and that process deserves to be told, that those stories deserve to be told. And the people for whom we are doing so, their stories also need to be told. And we're doing so, and to understand that the role of the storyteller in collaboration with movement is to bring forth the values within the stories that can help us make the communities and the country we want to see. It is a liberatory practice because it is in community, and it is driven by the ancient systems of storytelling. Because all the griots of the past told stories for a purpose. It was to pass down values. And so journalism does that. It passes on values, and those values help shape culture. And as we know, culture shapes policy, it shapes action, and it shapes the violence that is leveraged against our bodies. And so that means it can be leveraged to create the world that we want. We can be sharing the values in those stories in order to create a culture of change. That's how we sort of framed it. And I added my own little sauce at the end there.
Thank you for that, Manolia, and for the little flavor. What did I, the sprinkle?
Love it. Yeah.
I want to, there's a question in here, and it, Brandy, you were in the chat talking about antitrust legislation and antitrust struggles, and there was a question that came up in the Q&A around the role of digital sovereignty and intellectual property law. Could those things be helpful as we're exploring media reparations? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the antitrust legislation and litigation, and then also a little bit about digital sovereignty and intellectual property law.
So yeah, I mean, I think I'm less versed on intellectual property, but there has been a taking of our thoughts and our voice in a lot of ways that intersects with intellectual property that goes back, several generations, whether that's music. I think Netflix has a show that talked about The Lion Sleeps Tonight and the genesis of that song and the way in which that was stolen from folks, and the ways in which social media in general has built its cultural relevance on our thought, our pain, our trauma, our protest, our joy, everything from the gifts you see that use our faces without paying us for that, to the ways in which our presence on certain platforms gives it relevance even when they can't make money, such as the case with Twitter. I think on this broader question of antitrust, anti-competitive issues. So I think everything everybody said is so important, and I want to add to that as a systems person, looking at the broader ecosystem and what that means for us. Oftentimes, I see conversations happening around anti-competitive issues that are happening absent us, even though we're the ones that suffer the worst from those anti-competitive practices. So in the instance in which we're talking about Sinclair, a media company that's quietly been able to buy up over 200 local news stations, has recently got the largest fine in FCC history for anti-competitive practices, but a little bit too little too late. Like, they're airing conspiracy theory, like conspiracy porn, regularly peddling anti-Black, anti-our communities tropes through this lens of local news, which even when we have questions around it, is still met with a sort of assumption that bias is not there on the same level. So when you watch your local news, you don't think that you're being programmed to look at a sort of national landscape through a right-wing lens, except that's exactly what's happening. And when you look at social media companies too, Facebook is essentially serving the function of a social utility, whether or not we fully recognize that or not. And part of what that means is they dictate which news comes to the top of the surface. And so when you see the top 10 news hits that we're seeing every day, it's perpetuating right-wing thought all of the time. And that's what's getting into people's news feeds. And then we're being asked to pay more just to organically reach our audiences with our media. You know, Free Press says this all the time, 90% of media is owned by 6 corporations. And so I want to close also with this thing around time, and something that Joe Torres always says way more eloquently than I'm going to say. And that's every time there's new technology, like, marginalized communities are at the vanguard of that. We are building it and we are using it, and looking for liberation through that process. And then the status quo closes in and make sure that those gates close to us. So for every new opportunity and medium, here come the gatekeepers to lock us out of the things that we've actually made relevant. And so if we're not engaging this antitrust, anti-competitive, broader role of government conversation outside of individual content creation, if we divorce those two, then I think we're really going to be lost in terms of what are the solutions that are most helpful to our communities.
Ashe. Thank you for that, Brandy. Before we're gonna go into some visioning in just a moment, but I want to do a little bit of a speed round with the three of you. With our last question for the panel. Well, all of the, as I mentioned earlier, the questions that are left in the Q&A, we'll be kind of going through and curating those, and we'll be sharing those as an outreach and a newsletter to folks. So if you want to get those follow-up questions, feel free to sign up in the bit.ly that Colette dropped earlier that we shared to sign up for Media 2070, and we'll be sharing the answers to those questions and an outreach there. But for this last speed round of questions, I want you to share one dream, maybe in just like a few sentences, of when we think about reparations as a tool to decolonizing the media. What is one bold change that you want to lift up that journalists, tech workers, technologists, artists, activists, or policymakers could be dreaming about? So what is one of those one bold change? This will be our last question for the panel. Janine, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Throw it on me. My bold change has to do with structurally different outlets that are supported. It's not about whether they're run by smart people or clever people or woke people. It's about who pays the checks. So my dream is that we have a landscape in which media outlets are funded in various ways, not one perfect way. Academics, perfect. No, that's not perfect. Corporations, perfect. That's not perfect. Nonprofit organization, that's not perfect. We need a variegated landscape of different folks that people answer to. And my dream is that when we talk about how we feel about these outlets. We don't talk about who's cute, who's clever. We talk about their relationship to power. The idea of connecting the media outlets that we rely on for the news that we rely on to their relationship to power. That's my dream, is that we keep that in mind. Not any particular answer to it, but that we keep that in mind, that it's about the relationship to power that matters. That's my dream.
All right. Thank you, Janine. I'll pass it to you, Manolia, just because you're looking up. Brandy's looking down right now.
Smart tactic, Brandy. I got a lot of dreams, yo. I be dreaming a lot lately. I'll just share one that I think we're already working on at Press On, and that's to follow the lead of communities that are already building the kind of media they need and the kind of media that is centered on shared values of that community. I think it's really important because then it allows us to have a foundation of media that is localized, and therefore we are clear about what's happening in that community, because it's people who are from that community who are telling those stories, and they're telling a plurality of those stories. So to me, my dream is for us to follow localized communities that are already building the kind of media that is based on their collective values, which includes what a big point of what Janine said is they're funding it collectively. So just like we build our churches, just like we build our social service centers, like we are constantly building the institutions that we need as a marginalized, oppressed set of peoples. And I think that one thing we can do, and we've done it before, we built, there were 300 Black newspapers in the country at the turn of the 20th century. So we've done it before, right? But I would like us to follow the lead of communities that are already in that work right now, and to localize the process so that we can own the process of creating the news and media that we want and need.
All right, Brandy, it's you now.
I know my dreams are so boring because I'm just like, can we just like overthrow all of the mainstream media newsrooms and like get all of them to put in their like indignant resignation and take this shit over? And then I have the really boring dream, which is, can we get increased payroll protection for independent news outlets and direct federal funding to journalists of color and news organizations owned and controlled by people of color, particularly in this moment? We see a lot of our businesses going under without resourcing. So even just those kind of interventions, like I feel like I'm operating in extreme, but those are my two dreams.
Ma'am, there's nothing boring about overthrowing a white supremacist set of
For real, absolutely. And also funding. Funding is radical as shit, right? You know? Sorry.
Freedom is not boring at all. I'm excited about it. I'm especially excited about the redistribution. Cool. Thank y'all so much. I'm sure that if we could hear the folks who are in here right now, we'd be hearing so many rounds of applauses and snaps and all kinds of things that we'd be hearing from folks. So I want to thank you all for that. And I want to encourage folks who are here and who are able to type any thank yous or words of gratitude for our panelists in the chat. Because they are so incredible, and I'm so glad that we are all able to be in this space together. We mentioned earlier that we are going to be launching this project with an essay, Media 2070 project with an essay in late August. So if you do want to find out more about that and be one of the first folks to receive that essay, you can sign up in the link that Colette dropped. We're going to start hosting dream salons at the end of August and encouraging people working with organizations, coalitions, collaboratives across the country to also host dream salons wherever they are, to think about how we create a collective dream across all kinds of people of what media reparations is. And so to start that with the duration of our time together, I have a question to ask, and then we'll drop a link in the chat. I'm going to ask everyone to engage in a Padlet, which some folks might be familiar with. It's a place where you can drop Post-it notes. So on the Padlet, I want to ask everyone to answer the question, what could media reparations for Black people look like? How do we ensure that Black people have control over the creation and distribution of our own narratives and stories? And what opportunities are there for this to exist across various mediums of journalism, social media, technology, and creative practice? Ultimately, I want to know, what are your wildest dreams for the media landscape in 2070? So folks could drop some of that in this Padlet. I'm going to play a little music to take us out, and thank everybody for being here with us.
Thank you to Alicia and Colette and the team at Free Press for bringing this vision together, organizing us in this way. We are so grateful to you. We are honored by the work that you do, and we are so and we just love y'all. We just love y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Let me say that on apart from FAIR as well. You know, we do our thing in our corner, but we're always so honored and excited to be part of stuff. We want to contribute. We want to be part of something that's moving forward. And I just love the opportunity to be here with y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
I'm going back to the south. I'm going back, where my roots ain't watered down. Growing like a baobab tree of life on fertile ground. Ancestor put me on game.